For those of you who don't know me, my name is Torrance. I'm the campaign director at the Wilderness Committee, and I am calling in tonight from the unceded Lekwungen territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I want to acknowledge, when we're here to talk about forests and old growth and forest policy, that we need to keep front of mind and in the center of our hearts that all forests in BC and anywhere grow on the territory of an Indigenous nation. And the injustice that's been done against these ecosystems has a disproportionate impact on those people who they belong to and who belong to them. So solutions for these forests need to protect trees, they need to protect water and species, but they also need to protect culture and justice for those nations and include the return of land to Indigenous peoples. I also want to acknowledge, I don't always do this when I talk about old growth, but sometimes, and I feel like it tonight, that this is a heavy topic. It's really sad. Most old growth's been logged. There's lots of people who still want to keep going. And that sucks. So it's okay to feel sad about it or feel down about it. Take the space you need. All of you have your cameras turned off. So yeah, just keep that in mind, that it's okay to feel sad and feel heavy about these topics, because they are sad and heavy. So I'll run down what we're doing this evening. You know, it's been a long day, a long week. We didn't want to be here all night. We're going to aim for about an hour. Obviously, we can go a little bit longer if there's lots of questions rolling in, and feel free to go when you like. I don't want to talk for the whole hour. That sounds boring for everyone. I'm going to plan to try to wrap up in under half an hour, and then leave at least half the webinar tonight for Q&A. For the Q&A process, there's lots of folks calling in from the chat, which is super nice, or chiming in the chat. There is a Q&A function that you should be able to see on my screen. It's under the More tab. There's chat and Q&A. So just drop your questions in there. You can say, I mean, I guess we'll see who's asking the question, and when we're done, we'll read out those questions and I'll answer them as best I can. So that's the plan. And yeah, I guess we'll jump right in. I wanted to start, a lot of you will be familiar with this, but I wanted to start by way of a little bit of review. Basically, the current government got in 2017 and pledged to do forest policy better. They promised to do better on old growth and on forests in general. It took them a couple years to get started on old growth, and in the summer of 2019, they struck the Old Growth Strategic Review panel, which was a 2-person panel of expert foresters that did the largest and most comprehensive review of old growth that's ever been done in BC. They worked from fall of 2019 until the winter of 2020, just before the pandemic started. They handed their report to the government on April 30th of 2020, so about 18 months ago now. And the report is quite good. It calls for a paradigm shift in the way that forests are managed. It calls the status quo unsustainable. It said a lot of the things that our movement has been saying for decades, and it was really good to see that in a document that the government endorsed. The Old Growth Strategic Review had 14 recommendations. Some of them were quite large and broad and long-term. Others were specific and short-term. And among those was the deferral of at-risk old growth forests. And the call for deferral, it wasn't made lightly. The Old Growth Strategic Review panel was 2 foresters. These are professional foresters, industry guys. They've been in the industry and in government for 50 years between them. And they said deferrals are needed in at-risk old growth to prevent the irreversible loss of biodiversity. This is not a light statement, and for this to come from 2 foresters rather than from our groups or from individual activists or scientists, as it always had, it was a big deal. What we didn't see was the follow-through on that. Shortly after releasing the Old Growth Strategic Review report, the NDP called a snap election to try and get a majority government, which they did. on the campaign trail, they went further, and John Horgan promised to save old growth forests. He said old growth is more valuable standing, and we're going to save old growth forests. That was the promise, and that's what we've been holding them to and need to keep holding them to. The winter rolled along. Obviously, COVID was the focus for government. It was the focus for most of us. And coming into the spring, as the direct action land defense movements on the South Island began to heat up, we started to see the injunction come down, the blockades at Fairy Creek and the Kaikous Valley get more live. And then in June of 2020, as arrests had started, or 2021, pardon me, as arrests had started at Kaikous and at Fairy Creek, simultaneously, just about in 1 week, the Pachidat, Dididat, and Huayet requested the deferral of old growth logging in the Walbran and at Fairy Creek in the watershed proper, which the government accepted. And the next week, they announced this technical advisory panel, right? Another panel. And even like mainstream media pundits were like, really, another panel? The technical advisory panel, as it's called, we saw it as interesting. 3 of the 5 panelists are expert scientists in this field whose work we've been pointing to for years. There's some funny criticism in the news this week about how the panel was stacked because environmental groups used to have the past work of the panelists up on our website. It's like, of course we did. We've always been calling for a science-based approach. So of course we're going to have the work of scientists on our website. That doesn't mean they're Wilderness Committee staff or Sierra Club activists. It just means they're scientists whose work we've supported. Rachel Holt, Karen Price, Dave Doust, as well as Lisa Mateus from Organizing for Change, and Gary Merkel, who was one of the original panel authors, the original report authors. And the government struck this to say, look, we need to let science guide this deferral process. We need to put science in the driver's seat. I saw it at the time as best case scenario, it was to build the scientific rationale so that if they did eventually do something on old growth, they'd have that kind of as a shield to fend off some backlash from the logging companies. And then my cynical side said, oh, they're just putting good scientists on their panel as another stall tactic and to kind of placate the public a bit. The TAP did its work over the summer, despite the fact the forest minister said more deferrals are coming in the summer. That never happened. And then this fall, it became pretty clear that the technical panel was concluding their work and that this was going to be coming out. So essentially, that's been the process. There was one more wild card that I want to talk about. Week before last, the government introduced amendments in the legislature to the Forest Range and Practices Act, which is FRPA. And that kind of threw lots of folks for a loop. Everyone was like, is this the old growth changes? And it wasn't. FRPA is like it's kind of like the owner's manual for logging in BC, like the owner's manual is for a car. And it's sort of on the regulatory side. The government pitched it as, hey, look, we want to make all these changes, but we can't because of the current rules. So we're making these changes to enable us to make these changes. Whether that's what they were doing or whether they're just creating the perception that they're ready to make change, I think that's a big question to be asked given this government's track record. So those came out, and then sure enough, about 10 days later, on Tuesday of this week, November 2nd, they unveiled their new vision, I think they call it, for old growth. So I'm not sure, did we figure out screen sharing for that chart?
Yep.
Okay, can you share that chart now?
Sure.
So hopefully this chart will pop up on your screen and you'll still be able to hear me, but see the chart. I don't see the chart. Oh, there we go. Cool. All right. So what we're looking at here is essentially the new numbers on old growth. It's important to kind of take into context what the government used to say. So if you look at that top box, the government they've always said there's about 56, 57 million hectares of forest in BC. For context, the total area of BC is 94 million hectares, right? So it's about 2/3 of the province has some kind of forest on it. The rest is rock and glacier and snowfields, as well as cities, farms, water, and other land cover that's not forest. But up until this week, the government said there was 13.7 million hectares of old growth, right? And you can see that number in the top box, left-hand column, bottom row, that's dropped to 1.1. So the government, they admitted this week they overestimated old growth in BC by about 2.5 million hectares. For context, Vancouver Island is a little over 3 million hectares. And they also had estimated protected old growth, which is bottom row in that second box, middle column, at 4.4 million hectares. So they overestimated protected old growth by almost 1 million hectares too. So these numbers are closer to what groups like Wilderness Committee had determined when we'd done our mapping, and it's good to see that reflected in the reality. Below the bottom box is what government has gone with with what the technical panel has gone with, for the deferral recommendations. So they've determined that of the 11.1 million hectares of old growth, 7.6 million of that can be categorized as at risk. Either big treed old growth, rare old growth, or ancient old growth. You can see the breakdowns in the middle of how much of that is protected. And then the far column is how much is, the second from right column is how much is unprotected. And then the column on the far left, in pink, is how much this panel has said, this is the most at risk and it should be deferred. So a little bit about this breakdown for rare, ancient, and big tree. Basically, like there's a million different ways to classify old growth. This is the kind of the crux of this debate, and industry and government prior to now have said, oh, there's more than 13 million, because that was the old number. There's more than 13 million hectares of old growth. That's a huge amount of area. We're never going to run out. It's all good. But they ignored that most of that old growth is not what we picture when we think of as old growth, right? It's not all a Fairy Creek or a Carmana Valley or an Argonaut Creek in the interior. It's a lot of it is high mountain forest or coastal bog forest with small trees, low biodiversity, still with value. It's not worthless. It's just vastly overrepresented, both in remaining old growth and protected old growth. And it's less valuable for a lot of the reasons that we value old growth. It's less valuable for carbon sequestration because the trees are smaller. It's less value for species habitat. It's less valuable for Indigenous cultural resources. And of course, it's less valuable as timber. That's why there's so much of it. So the authors, Rachel Holt, Karen Price, and Dave Dowse, they've looked at old growth in different ways in the past, right? They've looked in their Last Stand report. They looked at a category called site index, which is basically just an average tree height category. So the higher the site index, the taller the trees that area is able to grow. And they looked at remaining old growth on the very highest site index 25 and above. And they found that there's only, 30 or 40,000 hectares of that in all of BC. The next category above that, 20 and above, there's a couple 100,000 hectares. Those two site indexes are where the 1% and the 3% of remaining old growth numbers that we use a lot come from. This is the best of the best, the very rarest old growth with the very biggest trees. but tree height is not the only thing that matters, and only looking at site index, you miss a lot, right? Because in some landscape units, there's no more site index over 25. Some in the north and the interior, there was never that highest site index, yet there's still important old growth. So that's where these other two categories came in: rare old growth and ancient old growth. So not all old growth that's scarce has big trees on it. Not all old growth that's scarce is really, really old. And then not all old growth that's really, really old, that ancient category, has big trees or is rare. So that's where these categories come from. And you can see there's much more of the total of the big treed old growth. So the panel recommended for deferral, they looked at these factors, right? And they recommended all the rare old growth be deferred because there's only 500,000 hectares of it in BC. All the ancient old growth be deferred because there's only 400,000 hectares of it in BC. I believe they looked at for big tree rather than go with it all, which I probably would have done. They picked the 1.7 million hectares that are most likely to be logged next, and that's what they recommended for deferral, and that's what they went with. So total, those three categories totaled up, you get 2.6 billion hectares of old growth. And we were told that this is the old growth that's most likely to get logged in the next couple of years. This is what needs to be set aside. In conversations that I've had with the panel, they've said, look, they see this as the floor, not the ceiling. So that's by no means set this aside and then walk away, we're done. This is a starting point. This is to buy ecosystems some time. So you can see that breakdown there. Basically, there's 500,000 hectares of at-risk old growth, and the panel has recommended that a little over half of that be deferred immediately. Again, 2.6 million hectares for a reference point. Vancouver Island is about 3.1 million hectares. So that's kind of what was recommended. Thanks, Sam. The government released this methodology and essentially they adopted it. So in terms of what's changed this week, government released this methodology, they adopted it. They said, okay, these are the numbers we're going to use. It's hard because there's old growth falling. We're so frustrated. This is a painful topic, but to try to separate and look that like the government getting these numbers right is a big deal. It is a big step forward. They've been in denial about these basic stats for a long time. So them taking this on, it is a step forward. It's just real late for that first step. They stopped short of just doing what the panel said. They stopped short of deferring everything. They said this 2.6 million hectares is what we intend to defer. That's our target for deferral, with one exception, and that exception is BC timber sales. So a quick review: BC Timber Sales is a standalone government agency that is essentially the in-house logging company for the government of British Columbia. Everyone who works for them is a government employee, and they control about 1/5 or 20% of all the logging in BC. So government staff plan out the logging, they map out the cut blocks, they contract the road building, and then anyone with a small logging company can just bid on those cut blocks. And the highest bidder gets the block, the government gets the money, and the company gets to then go in, cut down the wood on a cut block and sell it wherever they want and keep that money. So that's the BC Timber Sales program, and it's unique this week because the 2.6 million hectares that was recommended for deferral that overlaps with BC Timber Sales, that deferral is in place. So basically, because government controls the planning and they control the logging, the ministry has just directed BC Timber Sales to not plan or any new road building or cut blocks and not auction off any new cut blocks. It sounds like existing cut blocks that have already been auctioned will go ahead, which is frustrating. But in terms of new planned logging, that won't happen. I've got our mapper kind of crunching the numbers basically and overlaying the map with the 2.6 million hectares with BC Timber Sales. Assuming that it's evenly distributed and the the old growth that's recommended for deferral is equally distributed across all of the provinces, all of the BC, then about a fifth of it should fall within BC timber sales, because a fifth of all old growth, a fifth of all forest falls within BC timber sales. So that would mean about 500,000 hectares of at-risk old growth won't have logging planned in it starting right now. Which again, very late in the game, very, very late to just be starting, but this would be the biggest move. This is the biggest move that this government has made on setting old growth aside. Unfortunately, that's basically where they stopped. So the rest of the at-risk old growth across the other 4/5 of BC that's not in BC timber sales, it's that nothing has changed. I'm seeing a lot of mention of it in the media that this is a deferral. The government deferred 2.6 million hectares of old growth. You know, what a great job for the government. That hasn't happened. They signaled that it's their intention to defer, to do these deferrals. Again, across 80% of the province. They've said that the reason that they're not moving ahead with the deferrals is because they don't want to make that decision unilaterally, and they're waiting for approval from the First Nations whose territory it's on. This has been the government's line on this for quite some time. Look, you know, we're the UNDRIP government. We don't want to protect forest unilaterally. That's colonial. That's repeating colonialism. Here's the thing: it's not that seeking approval for protecting forests from First Nations is wrong. It's the right thing to do. It's a good standard. It's just that it's a double standard, because as probably most of you know, that's not the same standard that logging is held to. So companies are legally bound to consult with nations. They have to send First Nations band offices their logging plans. They have to ask them what they think. But they don't have to wait for a yes. They move ahead, the logging moves ahead, whether it happens or not. Or pardon me, whether agreement from the First Nation comes or not. So to require agreement, the government's been very careful and hasn't said consent, but that's essentially the standard that they're holding, to require agreement or consent for setting aside old growth for 2 years, when that's not required for cutting it down and removing it from the land forever. That's just, I mean, that's bullshit. That's the only way to sum it up. It's not right. The other piece is that by throwing this decision over to nations, it's putting them in an unfair position. The old growth crisis, the fact that so many people are upset, and the fact that there's so much passion to end this practice and to protect old growth forests is only one party's fault, and that's the government of British Columbia. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, he said they're leaving it up to nations to fix a problem that they created, and as usual, Grand Chief's right on the money. Lots of nations receive benefit from logging, revenue sharing agreements by which some of the revenue, the stumpage revenue from logging that the government receives goes to nations, is shared with them because it's their territory. And as far as we know, we've received no indication from government that they plan to compensate nations should they accept deferrals on their territories. So what that means is that it's not a choice between letting logging go ahead or accepting the deferrals and talking for 2 years. It's potentially a choice for a lot of Indigenous communities to give up badly needed revenue. And that's not a fair choice. The BC government, the Horgan government, promised to save old growth. And so if there's communities that benefit from old growth logging, it's on the BC government to square that. They need to make it at least as economically beneficial, if not more economically beneficial, for First Nations to accept deferrals than it is to accept logging. We haven't seen that, and so there's huge question marks around how much of the 2.6 million hectares is actually going to get accepted for approval. So this is where it sort of breaks down for me that, you know, the government promised a paradigm shift, they promised a seismic shift, they promised to save old growth. Not only have they not classified all remaining old growth as at risk, but they haven't even they haven't even targeted all at-risk old growth for deferral. And then the part that the half that they have targeted, they haven't actually gone ahead and done it. So it's extremely frustrating to see this in action and to see this heel dragging, and it's really hard to see this as a good faith process by the government. So, I mean, the reason this is such a big deal is because of what's been lost in the meantime. Before I wrap up, I want to run through a quick case study. I posted this on social media this afternoon. Basically, the mapping just came out on Tuesday. We have a part-time GIS tech on staff here at the Wilderness Committee who has been crunching these numbers for us. And I had him, you know, he said, what should I do first? And I said, do TFL 46. So TFL, or Tree Farm License 46, is the big forest tenure on southwestern Vancouver Island in Pachidat and Dididat territory, where the Kaikous is, where the Walbran is, and where Fairy Creek is. Em, can you share that map? I'll have Em share the map in a second. I'll also drop, or she'll drop the link to the map. We have it up on our website, and we'll drop it into the chat because obviously you can see there's a huge level of detail here. It's pretty high res up on our website, and again, and we'll drop that link in the chat in a second here. But essentially, what our mapper has done is overlay the government's new layer, the government's target deferral areas, with the TFL map and with the logging plan. You can see all the planned and approved logging in red there, if you're zooming in at home. And the reason I had him do this area rather than the whole province or rather than somewhere else is just because there's been so much conflict here in the last 6 or 8 months. There's been more than 1,100 people arrested right on this map area. So yeah, Em's just dropped the link in the chat there. So if folks are at home, want to zoom in, or you can do it later, you can see Fairy Creek just above Port Renfrew, and just based on my high level look, Jeff finished this map at like 3 in the afternoon today. It looks like some of the logging that's behind the blockade lines, or has been behind the blockade lines in Fairy Creek, is considered at-risk old growth. So had the government moved quicker, it would have been, and just done the deferrals like they promised, this would have been set aside. Some of the areas aren't. Some of the areas are not classified as at risk. A really heartbreaking piece for me, and a place that's really close to my heart, is the Kaikous Valley, which is further north and further west in unceded Dididat territory. And essentially, it's really well known because our colleague TJ Watt from the Ancient Forest Alliance shot his before and after photos here. So he went in when the logging was planned and he shot photos of gigantic red cedars. And then he went in after the logging and shot the stumps from the exact same angle and location. And these photos have gone around the world. He's won awards for them. They've been viewed millions and millions of times. And this was all logged while the planned, approved, and logged while the government was undertaking this review process. I was in the room when TJ said to the former forest minister's face that there was at-risk old growth in the Kaikous Valley with some of the biggest trees he's ever seen that was going to get logged while government was talking about doing better. They logged it. His photos went viral. This spring, blockaders, brave grassroots activists from who had set up around Fairy Creek, they learned about new logging plans by Teal Jones up in the Kaikous, and they set up a blockade there on Easter weekend. They held it for a couple of months, and it was actually the first place that the RCMP moved into after Teal Jones got its injunction. And they started arrests there, I think the 3rd week of May of this year. They eventually broke through the blockade. It took them another couple of weeks to remove tree sitters, and all the blocks in this area were logged in May and June. And all of them, we can still see on this map, have that high value at risk old growth in them. So again, if the government had, when they got the recommendation from the panel to defer at-risk old growth, if they had struck the second panel, determined where the at-risk old growth was, and deferred all of it, the logging behind the Kaikous blockades never would have been planned. The Kaikous blockades never would have been necessary. This shows just like the problem with talk and log, right? It doesn't matter about intention. It doesn't matter how much the government says they want to change. Without actual changes on the ground, this keeps happening. And again, outside of the BC timber sales areas, this is still open to happening now. Can you exit out of the full screen, Em? I guess I can just reopen my notes. There we go. So yeah, I wanted to tell that story. Like I said, I posted a longer version with links and some photos and the zoomed in map, so you can actually see on my social media earlier today. But I wanted to tell it because it sums up just how inappropriate it is to talk about a new process to determine the future of old growth forests that aren't going to be here in another couple of years of talking about it. Our asks, so in that light, the Wilderness Committee and some of our peers are just calling for all at-risk old growth to be deferred. Just do it right now as a start. Compensate First Nations for potential lost revenues. The government knows how much these revenue sharing agreements are worth because they're the other party. Write checks for that amount or more, right? So that it's more economically beneficial for nations to accept the deferrals for a couple of years, then have the talks for a couple of years, determine in a nation-to-nation process a long-term process for the future. The deferrals shouldn't be the end game. They shouldn't be the final stroke that determines what happens to this forest forever. They should be a patch in the hull. They should be a tourniquet to stop the bleeding so that we can have a conversation about forests that are still going to be there. So what can you do? We built a letter writing tool to MLAs. It's pretty critical that MLAs hear pressure on this right away. They basically said, you know, the forest minister and dozens of MLAs yesterday said, you know, we've heard from thousands of our constituents, from members of the public. We know people are mad, and this change is to address that. So we know that it does make a difference. It does matter. And yeah, I'll get Em to drop that link in the chat right now, and it's basically got you know, points to make that say, hey, look, it's great you're embracing the science, you need to act on it before it's too late. If you're doing old growth activism in other ways, keep doing it, right? If you're organizing rallies in your communities, I was up in Nanaimo just this past Saturday at a really great locally organized rally against raw log exports and old growth logging. Keep doing that. Get in touch with frontline organizers. You know, there's blockades at Fairy Creek. Learn about these initiatives and get into them in a way that makes sense for you. Also, I think this dynamic that through which nations are being put into this position where their agreement is being asked for conservation, but not for logging, where they're offered compensation for logging, but not for conservation. This shows just how connected the plight of old growth forests is with the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. This crisis, the fact that we have an old growth crisis in a jurisdiction where we've had a couple hundred years of colonialism is not coincidental. They're very intricately linked. And so supporting First Nations is key. Find out whose territory you live on or whose territory the forest you love most is on, and do what you can to support them. Some projects that we're working on here at the Wilderness Committee are supporting the Untitled Nation, which is undertaking a title case to get title to its territory back in Clayoquot Sound, or pardon me, in Nootka Sound. Basically take control of the land back from Western Forest Products, the biggest logging company on the island. Learn more about the new chatlet at the link that Em will drop in the chat in a second here, and do what you can to support them. We're also working with the Mumtagela Nation, which is a small nation on a small but mighty nation whose territory is in the northeast part of the island, near the Sitka Valley, kind of west of Sayward. This is Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And the Mamtagela are also reasserting their nationhood, both on the land in the form of the Little Big House project, and through legal work to reestablish their rights as a recognized nation. So learn more about the Mamtagela at that link. And yeah, that's finally, we have a role to play at the Wilderness Committee. We don't do everything. We try and do what we can. We try and do it as well as we can. If you appreciate that work, we can only do it because of the support of folks like you. So if you can support us, and we'll drop a link to support the Wilderness Committee, to donate to the Wilderness Committee too, or share that around if you like. 7:37, not bad. My mouth's pretty dry. I talked pretty fast. Hopefully you got a lot of that. We're going to switch over to Q&A. Again, we don't have a hard stop time at 8 p.m. We do want to respect folks' time. We can go a little over time. But yeah, for questions, Em will jump in and start reading out some of the questions. There's been some questions in the chat, but I think we'll start with the ones in the Q&A. If we don't get to yours, or if you don't want us to read your question out on here, that's fine. Just email us and we'll answer it later.
Hello, everyone. I'm Em. I'm the Vancouver Island campaign organizer for Wilderness Committee, joining from Lekwungen territory here. And I'm going to moderate Q&A. And I'm just going to read through from the Q&A section. So if you want to post your questions in that little link on the bottom. We'll start at the beginning with Serena. Hi, Serena. Good to see you here. Serena's question is, where intact old growth and intact watersheds come in, since I saw that map on the BC government website as well? Why aren't those areas being prioritized?
That's a good question. As far as I know, they are being prioritized. That was one of the factors, along with actual like threat of logging, and then the type of forest, how ancient it is, how rare it is, how big the trees are. That's a really good question. But I believe the intacts are prioritized in the deferral areas too. They're just represented a little bit differently on the map. Because I don't know the answer 100%, I'm fairly certain that that's the answer. But yeah, I'll check in with some of the panelists on that if I can get a hold of them. I'm sure they're pretty busy, or just reach out to government and ask them.
Great. Next question from Rosie is, if old growth is moved out of the TFL, will BCTS be compensated with other blocks of old growth?
So I think I understand the question. Basically, like, I mean, so BC timber sales is separate than TFLs. Basically, if all the forest in BC that's open to logging, 1/5 of it is in BC timber sales. The other 4/5 are in other form of forest tenure. And the most common one of those, especially on the coast, is tree farm license, or TSAs. There's also timber supply areas, community forests, district areas, and a few other forms of tenure. But with the BCTS deferrals, as far as I know, that's not the plan. So basically, BC Timber Sales has old growth, second growth, probably some third growth, maybe in the interior, but they've been directed to not plan any new logging from here on out in the 1/5 of the target deferral area that falls in, that probably, again, we're crunching the numbers on this, but probably falls within their tenure area. So if it's at-risk old growth that's recommended for deferral and it falls in BCTS's area, as far as I understand, BC Timber Sales will not be planning new logging in it, and they won't get access to old growth elsewhere either. They'll still have access to old growth within, just not the most at-risk old growth. Frankly, not the old growth that I think they were most likely to log next. I'll just make one more quick point on this. It's something that I asked government, and I'm still waiting for an answer on, but they've just gone ahead and done it on BC timber sales, right? So why couldn't they just go ahead and do it on different forms of tenure? It's really frustrating. It's not like the old growth is any less rare if it falls outside of BC timber sales operating areas, and it's not like Indigenous rights differ or are more or less depending on the kind of tenure. Indigenous rights are Indigenous rights. So the fact that they just stopped old growth logging outright on BC timber sales, but not everywhere else, you know, it's hard to make the argument that that's about respecting Indigenous rights and not just being a bit afraid to stand up to logging companies.
Great. Another question is, doesn't BC timber sales surely operate on First Nations territory too? Why were those deferrals so easy?
Yeah, I saw that one. I've got the Q&A open too. I saw that one too, and I was trying to answer it preemptively. So yeah, of course. I mean, every tree in BC, every tree in Canada grows on the territory of an Indigenous nation. So all of BC timber sales areas are in First Nations territory. Lots of the logging on BC timber sales happens without Indigenous consent or even proper consultation. So yeah, why could they move ahead and finalize those deferrals, but not on corporate tenure? That's a question for the government.
A question from Emily is, are you aware of any efforts to develop an economic transition plan? If not, are any organizations pushing for this?
Another really good question. Broadly, I don't believe there's not like a Green New Deal equivalent, say, where it's planned out and costed out for BC forestry. But there should be. It's something that I would love to see organizations like the Wilderness Committee do more of. We've kind of done the preliminary work a little bit for it. Our colleague Peter, our climate campaigner, he commissioned a study where a PhD student or a master's student did a research project called Northern Voices, and it was essentially a series of interviews with leaders in northern BC, a region that is filled with resources and has a lot of political connotations, but not as many people, so they're not heard from. So the researcher spoke to dozens of Indigenous leaders, municipal leaders, community leaders over the course of several months, and basically compiled a visioning exercise, what mattered, what people in the region wanted to see. And it was really interesting. And I think things like that could be the basis of moving forward. There was a mention in the government's announcement this week that I forgot to mention when I was just summarizing it, and it's around support for workers. So it's around transition planning, potential bridge funding, retraining opportunities for workers impacted by deferrals. This is encouraging. It's good to see. It's really hard to judge the quality of it, given that it's not costed. There's no dollar value behind it. So, you know, an economic transition plan with a couple $1 million, you know, is a lot different than one with a couple $100 million or a couple billion. Frankly, that's on the scale of what's required, not just for logging, although logging's a big part, but for all our sort of industrial economy. The alarm bells of the planet are going off. We're in a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, and a plan to give people meaningful livelihoods without compromising our future, that needs to be on the agenda of every government. So I lay this at the feet of government, not to abdicate our own responsibility. But yeah, in the way of an economic transition plan, some unions have done some work on this, think tanks like Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And then of course, some nations have done or are doing their sort of visioning plans for their territories. So it's a really good question. That the short answer is there's no plan finalized, but there should be from a few different sectors, but led by government.
Okay, the next question is also a good one, coming from Ross. During the 2-year deferral process, how will it be determined if the areas will eventually receive legislative protection?
That's another really good question. So essentially the process is deferral, and then engagement and nation to nation engagement about permanent land use. So a quick note on deferrals, like we get a lot of criticism at the Wilderness Committee for talking about deferrals or for saying these areas need to be deferred. You know, we have lots of people have said, like, I've donated to Wilderness Committee since before you were born, Torrance. Like, I haven't supported your organization to get old growth set aside for 2 years. I've donated to get old growth protected forever. And I hear that, and I feel the same way. When I presented to the Old Growth Strategic Review panel in December 2019, which apparently was less than 2 years ago, it feels about a decade and a half ago, they already were thinking deferrals. This was months before they finished their consultation. It was way before they finished writing their report, probably before they even started writing their report. And they were already toying with the idea of deferrals. They said, what do you think of deferrals? And I outlined those concerns. Look, deferrals aren't protection, they're not forever. And they said, right, but this is post-Chilcotin, this is post-UNDRIP in BC. The switch of land use from area that can be logged to area that's protected unilaterally by the BC government, that can't legally happen anymore. That won't legally happen anymore. It needs to be a joint process with government and First Nations. And then they said, and that takes years. And as you know, most old growth areas don't have years. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And they said, so we do the deferrals to provide space for that conversation. And that resonated with me, right? I talked about the patch in the hall or the tourniquet to stop the bleeding. But that's what we need. We need a cooling off space. We need to be, again, to quote Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, we need to be able to talk without the sound of chainsaws knocking down giant trees to drown out the conversation. So that's the kind of thinking behind deferrals. We have done deferrals before in the past in BC that have eventually turned into protected areas, most recently in parts of the Great Bear Rainforest. So yeah, that's the process is the deferrals happen. There's 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, 3 things can happen. 1, the deferral can get extended for another 2 years. 2, it can be moved into a conservancy or a tribal park or a provincial park or another form of permanent protection. Or 3, it could flip back into logging. Government will be under huge amounts of pressure to keep these deferrals, the ones that they do get deferred. I've asked what the status with the past deferrals, because keep in mind, there have been deferrals done in the last couple of years. They've just been either small, such as the Walbran or the Fairy Creek, or large but fairly meaningless, such as the first round of deferrals that were announced with the Old Growth Strategic Review in September 2020, which totaled hundreds of thousands of hectares of area, but upon closer look, they included very little actual good old growth, mostly second growth and poorer quality forest, a lot of non-forest data. The analogy, I was discussing this with some colleagues this morning, the analogy that I've been using is, if British Columbia is a face, the past round of deferrals were just circles drawn at random on the face. The rare old growth is freckles, right? So it's spread. I don't have many freckles, but people with lots of freckles, they're spread all over their face in small patches. This new approach to target, it targets the freckles, right? So it's a more ecologically sound process. We just need government to act on it. So those first round of deferrals, the ones in September 2019, those expire now in less than a year, in about 10 months. So we're asking, like, where are those at? Are those close to protection? Are they going to be extended? And we haven't got an answer on that yet. But that's, from what I understand, is the deferrals are to frankly buy the time for a long-term conversation. Kind of off the record, I've had staff at the ministry say the goal is to move them into protection, right? They're setting them aside with the goal to recognize that they're at risk of biodiversity loss, and the goal is for them not to be logged. So that was long-winded. I hope that sort of answered the question.
Great. Our next question, we have a lot of questions to go through, but we might not get to all of them, but I'm just gonna choose a few here. Geraldine says, what about the documented endangered species in TFL 46, and why is this not a priority? Very good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, Geraldine. The answer is because BC has terrible endangered species legislation. Another of Em and my colleagues, Charlotte Daw, works on endangered species legislation for our organization. This is a massive broken promise by the government of British Columbia. They campaigned in 2017 on implementing endangered species legislation, and then they got into office. They started moving in that direction, and then they walked away from it. They got vast amount of pressure by the logging and mining industries, and they walked away from it. And it's incredibly frustrating because there's a lot of old growth dependent species that are in big trouble. An angle that we're looking at is the Federal Species at Risk Act called SARA. That's not perfect, but it exists. So it's way better than BC's, which doesn't. And we have seen some movement around spotted owl on the Lower Mainland, in that the federal government and one of the First Nations with spotted owl territory in their territory put pressure on the government, and the government blinked and set aside some spotted owl habitat. So that's an angle that we're working on, but the short answer is this needs to be at the forefront. It's one of I'd say there's about 100 good reasons why old growth is more valuable left standing than logged, and that's one of the 100, and a big one at that. So it's an angle to keep pushing on. I understand there's like bird survey stuff. Ourselves, colleagues at organizations like Sierra Club BC are working on endangered species angle, and we're going to keep doing that. But it's a really good question. The fact that there's species that are staring down the barrel of extinction and they live in old growth that's still being approved for logging, it makes no sense, and is another example of failure here. And while you're picking out the next question, I just see a quick one about a replay of this webinar. There absolutely will. Up at the top there, you see we're recording, and we're also streaming live to Facebook. So I believe right after we finish, this will just live on the Wilderness Committee's main Facebook page. And for folks not on Facebook, we'll post the Zoom recording probably as a YouTube file on our website later. You can email us if you can't find it.
Great, I was just going to answer that one. Awesome. We have a question from Eartha. Hi, Eartha, good to see you. She says, nation to nation, in quotes, consultation suggests that BC is a nation. Is this terminology not inaccurate, and is it being used in the new bill?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm quickly wading out of my depth of legal expertise here. Yeah, I mean, like at international conferences such as COP26 that's going on right now, governments like British Columbia are officially referred to as subnational governments. You know, and then the Conference of the Parties is the nation, so Canada. Setting aside and quickly stepping past the questions about the legitimacy of colonial nations like Canada or BC, yeah, I mean, I believe that the two nations are the First Nations and Canada, but that Canada gives its provinces the ability to negotiate things like treaties and resource deals with First Nations. I don't believe the actual term nation to nation is included in. I mean, it might have been included in the documentation, the new vision that the government announced this week. There actually isn't a bill along with this week's announcement, again, which is concerning. We should have seen these deferral areas legislated, compensation paid to nations, and that consultation plan mentioned in the bill. But no, nation to nation is kind of a catch-all. I've heard it used by government, and I kind of use it as the government of BC sits down with the older, frankly, more legitimate governments and talk about what happens on these territories. The other question is you know, what happens when there's disagreement or layers of uncertainty within communities around who the legitimate voices for the nation are, right? The common example of this is the Wet'suwet'en conflict, right? Where you have one level of government, the Band Council government, and another level, the hereditary government, right? And you know, folks on both sides say, look, the Band Council one's the legal one. Others say, look, the Band Council ones only have jurisdiction on reserves. The hereditary governments are the legitimate ones. I think that these questions need to be sorted out by Indigenous nations themselves. And I think that this only it increases the rationale for hammering on the brakes in terms of logging, right? We need to provide these nations that have been subject to colonialism for several hundred years the space to make these decisions. And if we're smashing through a pipeline or cutting down the last ancient forests, that's not providing that space. So I think this uncertainty and how this consultation should look only strengthens the case for swifter and more immediate action to set aside forests in the meantime.
Okay, I'm just going to do maybe a couple more questions here. This one is from Eves. They said, what is government's position and intent for potential deferrals where the First Nation does not respond to their forest option in the next 30 days? And the second part of that question is, and will government's intent to announce actual deferrals be trumped wherever First Nations elects to negotiate deferrals through an agreement, arrangement, or treaty?
Yeah, really good question. So as far as I've been able to get, I mean, essentially what I do on behalf of Wilderness Committee supporters is just try to pry as much information as I can from government on this, and that's what I've tried to do on this file. And essentially, the understanding that I've been able to grasp is that until a nation says, yes, go ahead, we want to do this deferral, nothing changes, right? So again, you know, logging that's underway around Fairy Creek or anywhere else in BC is still full steam ahead until the nation indicates that, yes, they want the deferral. The 30-day piece is interesting. Media's made a huge deal about that. Some critical of the move have made a big deal of it. The way it was explained to me is they just asked nations to notify them of their intent within 30 days if possible, so that they could get started, so that more logging couldn't be done in the meantime. If nations want to take longer, I believe they can, right? I think if a nation says, hey, we want to take 60 or 90 or 6 months, they can. It's just to give those nations that want to move ahead with deferrals right away the option. There's also flexibility, I understand, around where area, around the actual what deferral areas could look like. So if a nation was to come back to government and say, hey, we don't want to do all of what you have proposed in our territory, we want to do less, I think they could also say we want to do more. That would be a really interesting scenario. They might say, hey, actually, the mapping data isn't accurate on that part of our territory because, again, BC is a huge province. The scientists on the panel are excellent, but they can only work, they're only as strong as their analysis is only as strong as the data. And no one knows what's actually happening on the land as well as the local nations would. So if they say, look, you know, you missed this one area down by this creek that, you know, our people know is filled with huge trees and there's you know, really important species and cultural resources there. You guys missed it on this map and we want you to defer that. I believe there's some flexibility for that. And then if the nations don't say anything, either they don't respond or they just say, no, we don't want these deferrals. As far as I know, government won't do anything, which is a frustrating piece because, again, that's not how logging works. Logging goes ahead whether the yes comes or not. And then there's also the incentive piece. After 150 years of colonialism, nations need revenue, they need support, they need to be able to support their people and their communities. And if a government that has promised to save old growth is not making it at least as beneficial, if not more beneficial, to accept deferrals, then they're not really trying. So I can't remember the exact second part of that question. The first part was around what happens with these deferral requests with the 30 days. I tried to answer that piece. What was the second part?
Second was, and will government's intent to announce actual deferrals be trumped wherever First Nation elects to negotiate deferrals through agreement, arrangement, or treaty?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, but by not implementing the deferrals right away, rather instead saying this is our intention, if nations agree, they essentially are deferring to that. I mean, they might not be. That's not what they do with logging or pipelines, right? They say, hey, we want to build this pipeline, we want to consult. If the nations say yes, they still, or if, pardon me, if the nations say no, they still build the pipeline. I kind of doubt they'll do the same here. But I believe, you know, the reason they didn't go ahead right away, except in the BC timber sales area, is because they are giving that trump card, for lack of a better word, to the nations.
Cool. We'll do 2 more questions just because they seem important, and then we'll wrap up.
Let's do 3 more.
3 more. Okay, you got to keep your answers a little shorter then.
Okay, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. And
Okay.
Folks, if again, if you don't get yours answered, or if you have one you don't want to ask, just email me. I'll drop my email in the chat right now. Sorry, Anne.
Okay, ready? So another question is there any mention of slowing raw log exports or of planting hemp or other crops in logged areas?
This is a great question. In this week's announcement, no. In general, when the government has talked about reforming forest policy, they've talked a little bit about tenure reform, which is really important. Changing who has the rights to do logging. It's one piece. The other piece is changing the actual rules and practices, because you know, a community forest still logging old growth or still exporting raw logs, you know, you could argue it's better than a corporation doing that, but it's still bad. Raw log exports is another issue that the NDP has gone from lions to lambs on since from their transition from opposition to government. Like, I've lost track of the amount of NDP MLAs that I've like marched with at raw log export rallies organized by unions. They used to take the mic and rail against the cruelty of the BC Liberals, and we're going to end raw log exports. They've been in for 4 years and they haven't done it. They haven't even really started. So to answer your question, no, it hasn't been tied, and I'm glad that it came up in this Q&A because they're intricately linked, right? We need to set vast swaths of forest aside, vast swaths of old growth aside, preferably all the old growth aside, and to do that without killing the forest industry, to still have a forest economy, we need to be logging second growth and third growth more slowly and turning it into more valuable things, not sending it overseas in its rawest format. So I see the two as really linked, but so far government hasn't.
Okay. Another question is, you kind of answered a little bit of this before, but it says in TFL 46, what areas are most important to protect that have not been deferred? So that's one part of the question. And the second part is, how does endangered species get considered for protection associated with old growth?
Right. So the first part, I mean, at this point, if it's still there, it's important, right? There's not, you know, massive valleys filled that don't have any roads in them. Most watersheds have been logged heavily. Part of why the Kaikous is so heartbreaking is because it's not like it's just a small little valley. It's a great big valley. Say it's my arm. The mouth of it is down at Nitnat Lake, and the headwaters are up near McClure Lake, which you drive past on the way into the Walbrand. And the area of Kaikous that I was talking about, where TJ Watt took his epic photos, it's like in one of my fingers. So like one of the little tiny sub watersheds that flows down into the Kaikous. I'm a visual learner, if you couldn't tell. And it's this last little pocket. It was this last little pocket, and they've just been smoking it for the last year. So I'd like to see no more logging in that watershed. I think it needs time to recover. The bigger tracts of old growth forest in the area are adjacent to existing protected area, like Carmanah Walbrand Provincial Park. So portions of the Upper Carmanah, portions of the Central Walbrand. Of course, all the intact fairy old growth adjacent to Fairy Creek is extremely valuable. So basically, like if it's in TFL 46 or frankly anywhere, Camper Creek, thanks Eartha, you know, the very bottom of some of those watersheds are protected in Pacific Rim National Park Reserve, but a lot of that is sort of that swampy, boggy coastal old growth that was never going to get logged anyway. So the shorter answer is all of it.
Great. And as Eartha said, Camper Creek is an example of that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, one last question that's really quick is where can one find access to the full provincial scale or grid selections of the map that you posted?
Right. So they are online. I'm going to try and answer the question while I pull it up. But basically, they're up online. They were released with the press release that the government put out on Tuesday. The PDFs that are up online are unfortunately like pretty low resolution, but they have the shape files, which are, you know, if you have mapping software or those kind of programs, that's what our mapper Jeff is working with. That's where you get the full resolution, and we'll be building maps and putting out that information like we did with the TFL 46 one. That's the link is further up in the chat as we make them. But in the meantime, there's just the ones that the government has posted. So you kind of get a sense, but that's the thing. They're not like big areas. They're not big areas of whole valleys or whole watersheds, because old growth is more fragmented than that. And hang on, I'm just pulling up these maps here, but they are up there on the government's website. If I can't find the link in time right now, I will. I'll make sure it's posted on our website or on our social media, or you can email me because yeah, I can't find it. But they're on the government's website, or if you just email me and say I'd like the old growth maps. All right. It's almost 10 after. I think we should leave it there. I really appreciate all these questions. I wish we had another hour, frankly. There'd probably be that much, there'd probably be that many questions. But yeah, get in touch with us. Em and I love connecting with folks, and we want to be helpful. We work for you, frankly. That's how we see it. And we want to help support people and get the info that you need and want to take action on this. I think that we've made the government blink. I think that they know they had to be seen to do something. I still think they're avoiding actually taking action. But if they do get forced to do so, it'll be by all of us. So let's keep it up.